Hey, Tachi. I can't hear you.
Now, can you hear me?
I can hear.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Oh, we've got people connecting. Great.
Yeah.
Um, Drop in a message in chat to introduce yourself and let us know who all's here. I tried to write something, but it came up DJ, so I am pretending I'm Touchy Jessie this morning. Boy, that you put it through. I didn't want you to put it through. In my Good afternoon, everyone. I see it's 12:15, and there may be others who join us along the way, but we might as well go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for coming to this members-only Zoom. And I want to thank Dutchy Jesse, for our development director, for setting this up and having the idea to invite Karen Rundlet, who's the CEO of the Institute for Nonprofit News, who will be with us today to talk about navigating nonprofit news in the new administration. So first, a few housekeeping notes. It looks like everybody has muted, but if you haven't, please do so. We're going to try and keep an eye on the clock and leave some time at the end of this for your questions. But feel free to drop them in the chat as we go along, and I'll try and keep an eye on that and introduce those, or at the end, if you want to come off mute and ask your questions yourself. And so before we get started, though, I have a really great announcement to make. On February 27th, we will be having our second Cardinal Way Civility Rules Luncheon, in which the top leadership from both parties of the Senate and the House will be joining us to have a discussion about some of the issues that they talked about and acted on during the General Assembly session, and how they did that from opposing viewpoints. I'll drop a link in the chat if you want to go ahead and register. It'll also be included later this afternoon in your reporter's notebook. And so you'll have first chance to go ahead and sign up before we release this to the public. So welcome, Karen. Today our executive editor, Jeff Schwaner, who's also here on the call, and I are pleased to welcome you. It's an honor to have you join us. So last January, Karen became the head of INN. She previously served as a senior director for the Knight Foundation's journalism program, where she managed more than $50 million portfolio of grants to newsrooms. She was also instrumental in the formation of the Press Forward initiative. Karen, INN right now has, I think, about 475 members, and which is up, about 25 in your year that you've been there. And I think when Cardinal News joined 3 years ago when we launched, there were about 350 members. And so that's great growth. So I thought maybe we could start this discussion with an overview about nonprofit news, specifically local news, and why there has been such growth of these organizations. What's the need they are filling?
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the members who came today, and thank you for supporting Cardinal News. I just want to say that membership is the members really have have given so much to this sector. So I think that we all know that local newspapers many of them have shut down across the country. INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News, has been around for 15 years, and we've lost thousands of local newspapers across the country. And nonprofit news has really been a growing sector. It's where journalists and community have come together to bring facts and reporting and community reporting to the public. We've lost a lot of local newspapers. This is sort of the solution. This is one of the solutions that's kind of risen up in the last 15 years. So that's a big part of the growth. And another part of the growth, particularly around local, I do think is inspired somewhat by Press Forward, because Press Forward has been a national campaign to say that we've lost newspapers. We still need facts. We still need local stories reported. We still need local stories told to keep us cohesive. And so that's kind of what's come about.
Hey, Karen, this is Jeff Schwaner. It's great to talk to you again. I wanted to fold in our idea that I call kind of the cardinal rule that our news should have local human impact with something that you mentioned in a previous podcast, saying that the nonprofit newsrooms are not here to save local journalism, but as you said in the podcast, to save an informed public. So I wonder if you could just comment on that, but also talk about in overseeing, the activities of so many nonprofit newsrooms, and many of them of a small size. We have 9 reporters. Are you seeing kind of best practices, especially under the current circumstances where we're seeing, a lot of executive orders where we're immediately wondering, how is this going to impact us? How's this going to impact us? If you've seen some kind of best practices for how these smaller newsrooms can handle that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So a couple of things I should talk about there. Local news, our members. So, we said before we have 475 members across the country. But local news, about half of them are local. The others are state, regional, some national organizations, like maybe you've heard of a ProPublica. and then some that are report for global audiences. But the local newsrooms, they are small and they are generally reporting in about three categories. They're reporting, they're checking out what city government or town hall or the village hall is doing. They're keeping an eye on that. They're holding them accountable, making sure those taxpayer dollars are spent the way they are supposed to be spent, for instance. Then there's sort of a K through 12 education. I didn't say anything about college. Most local news organizations are reporting on that. And then finally, sort of an arts and culture kind of category. And I didn't mention sports. Sports is actually still doing well commercially. This is about making sure that the public, the residents, still have factual information that we had lost when a lot of local newspapers closed. So, and this is about these important things, these important topics that keep us together, that help our communities to function. We need to know what government is doing. We need to know what government is doing, how they're spending, how they're making policies. But also, frankly, we just need to know the programs that exist, the programs that are beneficial. Like, how is the word going to get out about that? Same with K through 12. Information helps a community function. And when you have misinformation going through a community, rumors traveling through social media, you can't have a healthy community because people are informed by the wrong things. So those are sort of that's what it looks like across the country. These are small organizations. I can think of a one-woman newsroom in a place called Shasta County, California. She works with a lot of freelancers. She doesn't have any staff. But they're about, most of the local news organizations have staffs of around 5 to 7. And those are the kind of topics that they cover. So this for all of us is really about an informed public. It's not just here's another business, save the business. It's really about making sure that our communities are healthy. If we have an issue that we want to talk about, and I know that you're coming up on a different conversation. If you want to talk about an education policy, I know that there are great conversations where you are around solar power and being carbon free, for instance. Having a robust conversation based on the same facts is critical to moving forward on the issues. So I wanted to kind of share that. So in terms of some of the things that are going on, I would say right now, one of the things that we're trying to make sure our organizations, it sounds really basic, it's from a business perspective, but we're just trying to make sure that they have gone through their books and that if they were to be audited, they're in good shape. And we're trying to make sure too that, if they were examined, their labor practices would be right. So that's one of the first things that we're trying to do. We want to make sure that they're sound businesses in this time so that they can continue to do the independent reporting that they've always done.
Yeah, going right along with that, making sure that we have our ducks in a row as from the business perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to jump off into the, I'm assuming that's kind of, you're saying we need to prepare ourselves for any threats to like our 501(c)(3) status, right?
Absolutely. And I think too that there's a concern about that, certainly. But if you are trying to do good work and you're trying to do good journalistic work, and then you're asked to do something which takes a good deal of time, that can slow you down or take you away from the community service that you're providing.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to pay more attention to that than you are to the reporting that you're doing.
So when it comes to these mini crisis points where there's a large announcement made and the national news is kind of covering it in executive order or something, and then we start to see misinformation or disinformation spreading on social. We dealt with this on our own when we're covering the impacts of Hurricane Helene, for instance. But I'm just wondering, in general, we often don't have the time to fact check every piece of social that's coming around. We do have the time to determine that no, there wasn't an ICE agent at this Mexican restaurant 2 nights ago, but we don't necessarily have the resources to continually report on that. Have you seen any other newsrooms kind of engage in that in a way where they can still do some fact checking, but where they're not going down a rabbit hole chasing a story that isn't a story?
Absolutely. And I've also seen lawmakers on both sides of the aisle talk about misinformation that's spreading through their community. We certainly saw that as well in North Carolina after the hurricanes. Lawmakers from both parties sort of refuting misinformation that was spreading. I think that I'm sitting here with clearly concerned citizens. You took time out of your day to listen to what's going on with nonprofit news. That means you're engaged. That means you're reading. That means you're concerned about your community. You showed up and your members. So you've also contributed financially and otherwise to this community. I think it is about members also saying, this is a trusted source. INN members are not just any nonprofit newsroom. INN members have standards. INN members say, this is who donated. This is the list of they're financially transparent so that you know that it's not a partisan operation. That's one thing. We also make sure that our members do original reporting, that it's just not a link pulled from anywhere. And it wasn't verified. It was actually somebody who made the phone calls, walked through the streets, spoke to a source that they knew, worked on the data themselves. It's not just a pull from somewhere else and say, this is true. I think it's really important for all the members to say, my source was Cardinal News. This is a trusted source. And I know that because I've met the reporters. So I think those kinds of experiences, you're also advocating for the facts and the research and the deeply reported work. We welcome you to do that. I mean, this is for an informed public, and also the informed public can help celebrate facts in a time where we are seeing a lot of rumor and we're seeing a lot of ill-formed information.
Karen, when you talked with Jeff and I a week or so ago, you told a story and I'm hoping maybe you could share. And it had to do with people in your community with differing viewpoints and how that all came together and how news organizations can help foster conversations when people hold such strong and different views.
Oh, absolutely. And I see that Herb and Lynn have questions. Herb Rubenstein or Steen, I'm not sure, and Lynn Fontana. So we'll answer those too. So I used to work in an organization that invested in journalism and invested in arts and invested in the communities. And a lot of the community work was around public space. And that may sound a little kind of public space. Why? We all are increasingly living digitally. We are in social media, we are on our phones, we are on our laptops, we are maybe on an iPad. The world has gone increasingly digital. And so meeting in person at a park, meeting in person at a grocery store is kind of a big deal. I know that sounds crazy. There's a loneliness epidemic going on in this country. People are living in digital spaces even more than ever. So I told a story about one day how I saw arts, communities, and journalism come together in my real life. And it was
I'm listening to
Journalism.
about journalism in the age of Trump.
Oh, well, it's tricky.
Whoops,
Oh, yeah.
was my audio?
I think we're good.
it's tricky. Okay.
It is tricky.
That's what we heard. So I'll just share the story. I went to the park, the public space, and there was a festival celebrating the anniversary of my 15,000 person town. I live in a big metropolitan area, but I live in a 15,000 person village. I love my neighborhood. I love my community. And I was really excited to go. My daughter was there. There were teenagers running around. There were little kids running around. There was a band. So I've already said I was at the fields. So public space, and there was a band, and there were going to be fireworks. So there were arts, there was food, there was family. So we're there. It's a lovely night. And all of a sudden, somebody comes up and says, so they're going to build vertically right next to our neighborhood, and that's going to bring a lot of traffic, and that's going to bring a lot of people, and we're going to ruin the character of the neighborhood. And I said, okay. And she had a position, she had a point of view, and my husband started to talk to her about affordability where we live and how it's gotten so affordable. It's gotten really not very affordable for good people who work as teachers or firefighters. This city has become increasingly expensive, and it may not be the ideal solution. So they're sort of getting into this debate, and they were going back and forth, and there were things she said that he didn't agree with, and things he said. They were going back and forth, and then at some point, she said, "You know what? I want you to learn more." And she literally pulled out the local newspaper. It was called the Biscayne Times. And she said, there's an article in here. I urge you to look at it. And my husband said, you know what? I'm open to that point of view. I'll read this. And then she said, come to a meeting. I'll invite you. And he said, my name is Alex. And she said her name was Lisa. They shook hands and they walked away. And I watched this and I thought, that doesn't happen online. Nobody says their names and shakes hands and walks away. And that's the importance of like in person. And that's the importance of, and she offered information. She said, okay, right now you don't agree with me, but here's the article and come to a meeting. Let's engage further. And he said, you know what? I'm going to read the article and I'm going to go to the meeting. And he went to the meeting. And so I just thought, gosh, this is like all the work. It's being engaged in the arts, being at something that's community oriented, being in a public space, running into somebody that you don't know very well in your community, having a conversation with them, and sort of the civil, informed interaction that comes from reading an article. And so I just told that story because I was sharing that story because it was just a real life experience. And I think that's what Cardinal News is working towards, just making sure that people are still able to engage in a civil way and to listen to facts and to have an honest discussion about what's best for a community.
Karen, do you want to look at the question from Lynn? What are the most common sources of funding for local not-for-profit news org in communities like this?
Sure. Yes. So there's institutional philanthropy, and there is membership. There are sponsorships, which may come by way of events or might be something that is on the digital product. And membership, sponsorship, events, institutional funding, major donors. It's a little bit of a different mix in different communities. I remember speaking to, so I don't want to exactly say percentages because I think it's really different in different places. I remember speaking to a member that was in San Diego, and they did not rely on any institutional funding at all. They didn't try for foundations at all. It was major donors and it was membership. I talked to somebody else that was heavily funded by, there's a luncheon that we have at one of our conferences, and people get together based on size of community they serve and operating budgets. There was another one where it was just overwhelming that they had so many members that, it was like 74% of their total revenue. So I was just to hear these different sizes and these different organizations talking about that. So your generous contributions, you're actually making sure that people who can't necessarily afford the news have it for free. So I'll look at
Elizabeth, where she's dropped in a few comments, and one of them, and thank you very much for saying this, she mentions that Cardinal's reputation across Virginia is pretty solid, and and it's a trusted brand, and it's something that we have, worked extremely hard at. And because we have such a large footprint and we cover so many different communities with competing needs, and and we started this conversation, and it is a little political. These times are extremely political, and so it's something that we have to think about all the time as a nonpartisan, which is, again, maybe you can talk a little bit about how that factors into the nonprofit world of, really making sure that you are presenting things in a very nonpartisan way, and how that may play into the trust building.
absolutely. Look, I think we know that we're more polarized, and part of it is around the fact that we are living digitally when we are arguing digitally. I think one thing I really want to say is this is a local news organization, and so as there were fewer and fewer local news organizations, over 2,000. We've lost over 2,000 in the last 15 years or so. And I represent 480. So we still haven't fully made up for what we've lost. So what I want to say is if you're not paying attention to what's going on locally, what you're left with is national. So you are going to get informed by national sources, angry about national issues, but you're living locally. You're driving on local roads. Your kids are going to local schools. What happens with the basic issues that your local government is paying attention to and taking care of or not taking care of? If you're not engaged in that, you're getting upset about national problems. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be concerned about national problems, but you're living locally and being informed nationally. And so that's contributing to the polarization as well. You have to think about the problems that are directly affecting you and that you can solve in your community as well. So I wanted to kind of share that. I do see a question about members and subscribers. I think those are kind of, and I think Jeff, you have to help me with this one too, and Dutchie and Luann as well. Those are the terms that are sort of used internally. A subscriber was a little bit more of a business term. You pay for a thing and you get a thing. And a member is somebody that donates, and it can be at any level, and it believes in the work, the greater mission of the organization. There are members of museums that, for instance, that believe that the community should have art or this history presentation, and they donate, and they know that it's good for the school kids in the neighborhood or the community to they may not go there every weekend, but they donate because they think it's important for the greater good. And local news is a public good. I'm telling you, it keeps the community functioning if you all know what's going on in the community based on facts and not rumor.
Right. So Karen, when we talk about subscribers, we're generally talking about the people who are subscribing to our free newsletters, of which there's over 20,000 people. And members are, paying
Got it.
people who
Okay.
are committing money to our mission. they're both obviously important. And I think you mentioned earlier that the great thing about the crowd here, it's a great crowd tonight. The great thing about the crowd here is that you guys are understanding the importance of having a nonpartisan newsroom in our region, and to cover even hyperlocal news. And I want to pivot this awkwardly into, the idea that though it seems like we're going against the grain, I think it speaks to what you're saying earlier, which is since September, we put additional resources into covering public notices and agendas, the type of boring stuff that most people will not take the time to read, even though it's, public information, so that we can report on what's coming up in a board of zoning appeals meeting, or a planning commission meeting, or obviously city council meetings, boards of supervisor. And we're hiring for a report for America position for Lynchburg, so we can have a person there. But we're also using freelance reporters to dig into those issues in Montgomery County and in Lynchburg until we get that RFA reporter. So we're really trying to continue to branch out like that. And I think it's not the most glamorous side of Cardinal, but I believe that it serves those hyperlocal audiences. And I mention this because anyone who's listening today, if there's a city or a town that that you think we really need to expand that coverage into, we'll do our best. Let me know. Jeffrey@cardinalnews.org. But I wonder also, Karen, if you've seen that kind of tightrope walking in some of the other newsrooms where the news volume is heavy national, but the success comes from working locally.
Look, I looked at a few different homepages this morning, and I saw one that had the Grammys, and I was a little surprised for a hyperlocal news organization. There was a big photo, and I did notice that, but there was a lot of local coverage as well. So people do different things. What I can say is there is a lot of conversation in journalism circles at this point too, about utility and joy and relevance and value, and those are just sort of big broad words. But I think also when you're talking about public notices, you're saying that this is a service that is valued in the community, and so it's useful. And there's a lot of conversation about making sure local news is actually useful. And so I think I can point to other examples. There is an organization, for instance, it's pretty well known in journalism circles, and they did a landscape study. They did a study of how people receive their news. It was in Detroit. It's called Outlier Media, and they actually found out that most people receive their news through local TV or WhatsApp groups. So they created a WhatsApp group. And in the pandemic, the number of people that joined that WhatsApp group just tripled. And what they basically did was, at first, they would just answer basic questions. So if you had a question during the pandemic, there were a lot of crazy questions, people didn't understand it. You had a question, you would get to talk to a journalist and answer it. They would answer it on WhatsApp. And eventually they took all those frequently asked questions and they produced investigative journalists out of it, because they knew what the community was wondering. They knew where they had to follow up, and they could see the trends. They would answer, just hundreds of questions, but they would see where the pain points were, what the community was really worried about by that. And then they would produce investigative journalism and they would share it with other outlets across Detroit. So that's just one example of really deep listening, providing basic service, which is, here are the facts. Here's where you can call to solve this. here's where you can call to solve that. And then using all that data and information to produce journalism that, keeps power in check, but also just informs a community more broadly.
Karen, thank you so much for sharing that story about Outlier Media, because I've just found that one so fascinating all along. And we'll open this up in a moment for questions, but I thought, that's a good way of asking you to maybe share some of the interesting ways you've seen members sharing their journalism. I mean, we hold events, and I know a lot of people are holding events that, it's an extension beyond just filing this, really thoughtful big piece. And, social media, of course, plays a big role into it. But, what are some of the other interesting ways that people are connecting with their communities and, sharing this independently reported information?
Absolutely. So I'm thinking about an organization in Memphis, for instance. They did a lot of very powerful investigative reporting. They were checking on the billing practices of a hospital system, and they were overcharging residents. But at the same time, too, they decided to do an event, and it was a card game. So they had people play cards, and that was an event. And it was a bit of, we do investigative journalism and we hold power to account, but we also bring community together and we celebrate and we have fun. And so one of the things they did was a card game. So a bunch of people got together and played cards. That was again, back to events. I think there's a real conversation going on now about connecting in person. Additionally, I mentioned WhatsApp before. There are other organizations that are using that to have use WhatsApp to have daily coffees with their members. So people are using it in different ways to connect as well. I also can think of an organization in Kansas City. They actually did some work with the grocery store. They actually raised some money and bought some families in need groceries. And then once they sort of had them engaged around something very basic, like everybody needs food, everybody, that's a pretty universal, that's still not partisan. They were able to engage and say, this is what we do. This is where you can find us. We try to be useful to the community. These are the useful things that we provide. So, some really different ways of going about it. There are also other organizations, frankly, that have in Philadelphia. There's a pretty well-known collaboration that existed. It was called Every Voice, Every Vote, and not only did a news organization, say, partner with a TV station or a public media outlet, but they also partnered with some of the nonprofits in the community. Nonprofits, not nonprofit news, just plain old nonprofits that solve problems for community. And so they did a massive partnership. And one of the big issues in Philadelphia at that time when they did this, it was dozens of organizations that did a major collaboration. It was around affordability. So yes, those are just a few, and I could probably keep going and probably overwhelm you.
Hey, we do have a question, Karen, from Lillian from a few minutes ago, that I'm sure some of the Cardinal journalists who are attending this would also like to hear your input on. How do nonprofit journalists guard against self-censorship in contentious times? Left up to individuals, or are there protocols to follow? I'll just preface that by saying we talk it out, whether we think something is a story, and often enough it's those keywords of is there local human impact that we can discuss, but it's a deeper question than just that. So the floor is yours.
Okay. We're actually in the midst of quite a few conversations about that right now. I think it's great to hear that Jeff and leadership at your organization is trying to talk through with you how to protect you and to keep you safe. We've actually been in a lot of conversations about risks, both for journalists and for organizations. There are a number of organizations working on protections around digital safety, physical safety. I think I could name some of those, and I'm happy to talk to the journalists about that afterwards. Lawyers for Reporters, PEN America, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and I just want you to know, since it's in recent months, December and in January, and we've been sharing those resources with all our members. Those legal organizations have been meeting to figure out how to share the resources that they have. I think INN is also trying to do more about protecting your data and protecting your computers. So that's something else to think about: digital and physical safety, protection of data. That's all incredibly important. We do have public media members as well. You may be kind of following what's happened at the Pentagon, NPR, New York Times, Politico, NBC News will no longer have space guaranteed. There are different outlets will be brought in as well. New York Post, Breitbart. So I think access is another issue. And we basically identified 14 different risks. This is done out of CUNY. There's a risk assessment, and about 70 different organizations gathered to sort of think about the strategies to keep people safe. This is definitely a time of safeguarding journalists and journalism organizations as well. So, and then this is more something that leadership would be thinking about, but libel insurance as well. So, but I do want you to know there are resources out there to protect you, both as an individual and both in terms of, and foundations are also actively engaged in trying to figure out how to shore up these resources. Is that kind of?
I think that answered a secondary question that I had about kind of journalists feeling threatened. And I'd say, in general, I'll just say, coming over from a Gannett newspaper to work with Cardinal, I found that the people who communicate with Cardinal News are more often overjoyed that we're here, and giving constructive criticism and story tips than they are calling us fake news, which I used to get at Gannett all the time. I believe the question was a little bit more, or at least the question as it was phrased was a little bit more, how do we prevent from being gun shy, from being self-censoring in the stories? Like, how do we not hold off from reporting an important story? If we're feeling the weight of of other pressures that are larger than us. So that falls into your answer, but the
Right,
question
right.
was, how do we guard against that self-censorship?
Yeah. I think, look, I think that's a conversation that's happening in the newsroom. And I think that's, first of all, obviously you got to be able to back up what you're saying. I think that's really important. And you have to have done pre-publication kind of reviews, really strong reviews, all of that. I think I would want to believe that you feel that you can share these things internally with your editors, with your leaders, and you want to be able to back it up with the documents and with the data. And so I think it's about making sure you can still say the things you need to say to your teammates and your bosses and your leaders and your editors, and making sure that you can really back it up. And again, I don't want to kind of point totally back to the resources, but we're trying to make sure at INN that there are resources available so that there is proper pre-publication review. So I think you've gotta have the bold conversations in-house where it's safe, where we all believe in facts and saying difficult things. And then I think determining with your leadership where you go from there.
I think we're running short on time. I just wanted to give the opportunity if anyone wanted to come off of mute and ask Karen a question. Silence.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I keep hearing that Cardinal News is a trusted brand. So why? Why? We've got to get at that, you know? And I'm so glad that it is. But what is it about it that maybe there are things that I should be telling other members that Cardinal's doing right so that we can be a better sector. So if you just want to put that in the chat, what is it about Cardinal specifically that you trust?
Oh, I love that question.
I love the answers.
Mhm. I do.
And something else that I've been hearing a lot too, lots of in-depth facts. A lot of people don't get to even meet journalists anymore. Are you meeting Cardinal News journalists? I think that really contributes to fact, humor, self-deprecation.
You know, one thing that I think maybe you didn't talk a whole lot about was transparency. You know, and I'm wondering, you know, we try and be extremely transparent with who's funding us, and if somebody's funding us in this story, you know, we disclose all of that, and I'm trying to do that. And I'm wondering, and again, you know, if you want to drop in chat, how much does that play into how you feel that we're a trustworthy organization?
And I will tell you that's very much a next generation sort of requirement. If it, you know, I just read a huge report on Generation Z, and they're like, everybody's biased, but just tell me what your biases are. Put it all out there. That's sort of where they're coming from. You know, having grown up completely in the world of social media. And I think we talked about financial transparency, that you need to do that to be an INM member. But there's also a lot more, there are a lot more organizations saying, this is how we did the reports. We talked to 10 sources, only 3 were in this story. These are the documents that we reviewed for hours. This is the data and how we came to the calculations. And so there's a lot more of that in today's journalism as well. Not just telling the story, but putting a light on how you got the story.
Karen, is there something that you wanted to talk or say when you came on here that we didn't already talk about that you'd like people to know?
Look, I mean, I'm pro Cardinal News and I'm pro nonprofit news. I mean, I would just invite you to look, I'm talking to members too. I would invite you to talk to 2 friends today about why this is a community binder, why this is important for communities. So, and also too, I would invite you to talk to somebody like of a totally different generation to understand where they're getting their news. I hear people naming the problem all the time, but they just say, go to a trusted source. They don't tell you who the trusted source is. So if you trust Cardinal News, I'd ask that you just have a conversation with somebody else, 2 other people, and explain to them why they're useful and relevant and valuable to your life and how they help you do things.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to all of the members who spent their lunch hour with us, and really appreciate it. And thanks, Jeff, for
having me.
thoughtful questions. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care, all.